and welcome to this week's edition of #Africa, where we bring you the latest news from across the continent. I'm Rofiwa Madzena. Let's start with some of this week's top stories from Africa. Malawians are casting their votes in what has been described as one of the country's most unpredictable elections. Voters are deciding the fate of President Peter Mutharika, who's not only facing the official opposition as a rival, but his own deputy president, Saulos Chilima. Local media reports stated that Chilima had to face a 40-minute delay before casting his own vote due to his name not being on the voters' roll. Talks between Sudan's ruling Transitional Military Council and an alliance of protesters failed for the second day. Although the TMC and the umbrella body representing protesters agreed on a 3-year transition before elections, they failed to reach an agreement on who would control a sovereign council that will hold the ultimate power. Street protests and a sit-in outside the Defense Ministry in Khartoum are still ongoing. Algeria's armed forces chief says elections are the best way to overcome the country's political crisis. Former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika quit last month following pressure from protesters as well as the army. But demonstrations are still pushing for political reforms and the removal of all officials belonging to the old guard. A presidential election has been scheduled for the 4th of July, but sources say it might be postponed. Is Pan-Africanism still relevant? Well, this will be part of the discussions at the Human Science Research Council's annual African Unity for Renaissance Conference, which is taking place from the 22nd to the 23rd of May in Pretoria. Now, over 100 leading researchers from across the continent are meeting under the theme Pan-Africanism for the 21st century, innovative paths for Africa's future development. To tell us a little bit more about this, we're joined by the Executive Director at the Africa Institute for South Africa, Professor Cheryl Hendricks. Professor, many thanks for your time. Let's start by unpacking what exactly Pan-Africanism is.
So Pan-Africanism is an ideology, a set of beliefs and practices about how we should organize our societies, how we should relate to each other. It has cultural expression, political expression, economic expression. Those beliefs are collective self-reliance, the humanity and integrity and dignity of all Africans, that we should be politically united, that we should integrate our economies, for example. It speaks to questions in its current form around how we should be developing our societies. It developed in the diaspora in the late 1800s, firstly as part of a call for the emancipation of slaves, and then later in the 1950s shifts to the continent as part of the call for decolonization. And as you know, the majority of our countries are now decolonized, though not all of them. We still have a few countries that need to go through that process on this continent. We think of Western Sahara, Chagos Islands, Mayotte as well. So that process is not fully complete, but we have shifted our focus of Pan-Africanism more towards issues of governance and development. And so Pan-Africanism is embedded in our institutions like the African Union, like our regional economic communities. It is embedded in our frameworks such as Agenda 2063, or speaking to the need for a peaceful, prosperous Africa.
Now, your theme this year discusses a very important time in our society, the 21st century. And given that time, would you say that this particular ideology is still relevant?
I think it's relevant because those basic principles of equality and justice and self-reliance still hold true today. That we have not unified this particular continent. I think we've done far better in terms of our cultural expressions. And so we all can identify with a continent called Africa. We can sing about it, praise it, adorn ourselves with it, have art that reflects our affinity to this continent, but we still have a long way to go in terms of the political unification of this continent and in terms of the economic integration of this continent. If we just look now at intra-Africa trade, for example, it is only around 14%, nearly 57 years after the formation of the Organization of African Unity. I still think we suffer from narrow nationalisms that impede this unification of our continent. If you look at the rise of xenophobia in South Africa, if you look at the hundreds of Africans jumping onto dinky boats and drowning in our oceans in an attempt to escape the conditions of this continent, then I think that our quest for a life that has a basic humanity, gives us a basic sense of humanity and dignity, we still need to reach that on this continent.
Yeah, and I mean, what I'm hearing from that particular response is that there needs to be greater responsibility from governments and organizations like the African Union when it comes to carrying out the very principles of Pan-Africanism.
Yes, the institutions with leaders represented there from our 55 countries that have been tasked with the responsibility of carrying out this agenda of Pan-Africanism. And so we as the citizens, we cannot simply abrogate that responsibility to them. We should also hold them accountable for implementing some of the agreed to frameworks and protocols, many of them excellent protocols, but have not been implemented in national states. So there is a big need to strengthen our institutions like the African Union, and they will be represented at this particular conference. There is a big need to reinvigorate, reimagine, reinvent Pan-Africanism so that it can speak to the particular challenges that we are facing today. And I think that this particular conference will then bring up these challenges and opportunities.
Prof, how easy do you think it will be to reimagine this ideology, particularly in a time of increased populism on the continent, as well as the protection of sovereignty in states?
Look, it won't be that easy, right? As I explained, there is a narrow nationalism that still prevails. It is the reason why we have not wanted to relinquish our sovereignty to organizations like the African Union. We've been holding on to that quite a bit and simply turning it into a secretariat more than anything else. So Pan-Africanism has always reimagined and reinvented itself. As I indicated, it emerges in a particular context, dealing with slavery, and then shifts towards dealing with the colonization of our particular countries. And now it has shifted again to development. What we need to do is popularize it far more among our youth so that they take it up, because it has to be embedded within our new societies, this new generation that we are giving forth. It has to influence the way we see science and technology. It has to influence the way in which we produce knowledge on this continent for it to come alive and speak to the kinds of challenges that we have.
Reimagining Pan-Africanism for the new generation. Professor, many thanks. I've been speaking there to the Executive Director at the Africa Institute of South Africa, Professor Cheryl Hendricks. When we return, we are joined by one of the organizers from the much-anticipated, sold-out MTN Bushfire Festival. Stay with #Africa.